I never imagined that a ruling could leave everyone, literally everyone, a loser. I'm Imani Brooks, a judge in Philadelphia. I'm 55 years old, and today I want to tell you about the most complicated case I had to resolve. A case where the law was clear, but the consequences, well, those ended up far from fair for anyone. Before we start, let me know in the comments where you're watching this video from, so I can see how far it's reached. This case landed on my desk a couple of years ago. A dispute between two families that, apparently, seemed simple. But when you start digging, you realize it's not just about legal papers or signed documents. There are emotions, past wounds, and decisions that affect entire lives. The law showed me a clear path, but walking it left deep scars. On one side was the Johnson family. Legitimate owners, with all the paperwork in order, claiming what rightfully belonged to them. On the other side, the Cruz family. People who had lived on that property for years, perhaps without a legal title, but with an emotional attachment almost impossible to ignore. A home for them, an asset for the Johnsons. The problem was that both sides had valid reasons to fight. So, how do you decide when both sides have justice in their story, but the law can only be on one side? The dilemma was real and made me question everything I believed about the judicial system. The law dictated one thing, but equity, that much-quoted word in my work, asked me for something more. During the hearings, I heard stories that broke the heart. Stories of sacrifices, generations who grew up in that house, broken dreams, and unkept promises. Hearing that made me aware that my decisions were not just ink on paper, but chains that changed lives. But what do you do when the law applied crushes those stories? My ruling had to be final. I couldn't let uncertainty persist one day longer. Applying the law was quick, clear, and without hesitation. But when I gave my verdict, reality appeared. Nobody was happy, nobody was satisfied, and above all, nobody felt like a winner or heard. The Johnson family regained their property, but at a very high price. The Cruz family had to leave a home they considered theirs, with no real compensation to ease the loss. And I, as a judge, found myself carrying the weight of a decision that was technically correct, but morally devastating. This experience taught me that justice often isn't justice for everyone. It can be absolute in the letter, but unequal and cruel in its essence. And the hardest part was accepting that sometimes there are no happy rulings or endings where everyone wins. So, if you ever believed that the law is always fair and clear, this story will make you see it differently. Because in those journeys you learn that the law is a double-edged sword, and true justice is not always found on the scales. If you've been through something similar, or know someone who's been in the middle of a legal conflict like this, leave it in the comments. And remember, justice is not just what the law dictates, but what decisions truly heal. Thank you for making it this far. See you in the next video. And don't forget to tell me where you're watching from. I love knowing that. When I received that case, I knew immediately it wouldn't be simple. It came to me wrapped in a tangle of legal details and human conflicts that bordered more on ethics than on mere legality. It was a dispute between two families, both claiming rights that seemed irreconcilable. On one side, a mother seeking justice for the loss of her son in an accident that, according to her, was caused by the negligence of the opposing family. On the other, a family that claimed the young man had been reckless and that they had suffered years of persecution and reputational damage without reason. On paper, everything was clear. The law provided a fairly definite guide. But in practice, how do you balance that weight between the cold letter of the law and the human warmth of those who looked at you with hope or despair, or sometimes resentment? Every hearing felt like a chapter of a drama with no happy ending in sight. Emotions were raw, voices faltered with tears, and glances sometimes pierced across the bench. I tried to listen with the calm that justice demands, but also with the attention that broken hearts deserve. I asked them again and again, "Are you sure of what you're saying? What do you really expect from this trial?" And the answer, though it seemed sincere, always appeared to hide more pain than they admitted. That made me think that in this case, not only was the strict application of the law at stake, but also the way everyone would bear the consequences of it. Little by little, the testimonies caught me in a whirlwind where the line between right and wrong blurred. Unexpected revelations emerged, Family secrets, unconfessed mistakes, misunderstandings that had escalated to the point of permanently breaking relationships. I particularly remember a testimony that turned the case 180 degrees. A key witness, who initially seemed neutral, confessed before the court a detail that no one had considered. With a trembling voice, she admitted to having seen the exact moment of the accident and that her silence had been kept out of fear and loyalty to one of those involved. That statement shook the foundations of the process and called into question evidence that until that moment had seemed solid. As the days went by and I listened more, the pressure to make a just decision increased exponentially. How do you judge when the facts not only present legal ambiguity, but also involve the genuine suffering of both parties? When I reached the final phase, the courtroom was filled with a mix of hope and fear. The eyes were once again fixed on me, not just as another judge, but as the custodian of the justice they desired, even if it was impossible to fully satisfy everyone. Issuing the sentence was one of the most difficult moments of my career. The decision I made respected the legal framework, however, I knew it would have painful consequences. On one hand, the family who lost their son would not fully see their suffering repaired. On the other, the accused family would be marked by a stigma that could not be erased quickly, not even with the partial acquittal I managed to secure for some charges. In that moment, as I pronounced the words that closed the case, I truly felt the weight of what justice meant, an ideal that sometimes must coexist with human imperfection. After the trial, speaking with both sides made one uncomfortable truth even clearer. The legal system can be just in theory, but it does not always offer comfort to those caught in the storm. I saw that mother walk away with silent tears, and the opposing family with faces hardened by frustration and helplessness. None of them truly came out winning, and more than once I wondered if, in reality, anyone ever wins in cases like that. Weeks passed after the sentence, and a simple, heartbreaking question kept resonating in my mind. Had I done the right thing? The logical answer was yes, because the law cannot be bent by pain, but the soul of the judge in me found no peace. Every time I passed by the courtroom where I delivered the sentence, I felt a lump in my throat. I knew that behind those official words were lives changed forever and scars that time might never heal. It was then that I understood something fundamental that is rarely taught in law schools. Justice is not an act, but an endless process in which empathy must be part of the scale, even if sometimes it seems to weaken it. That case changed me. It taught me that impartiality in the courtroom does not mean insensitivity to human stories. That being a judge is not just about applying rules, but also about understanding that the people we face in the courtroom carry with them much more than evidence and arguments. They carry lives, with all that implies of joys and tragedies. And that, even when we apply the law rigorously, there will always be wounds that cannot heal with a verdict. Over time, that sentence became a personal reminder of what is at stake every time I sit on the bench. It made me value the importance of seeking paths that, though never perfect, try to alleviate harm rather than multiply it. Today, when I review my case files, I mentally return to that dispute with the humility of knowing that justice, as beautiful and necessary as it is also deeply human. And in that humanity, perhaps, lies its greatest challenge and its deepest lesson. After that unexpected turn in the testimony, I felt everything inside me begin to rearrange, even though the storm did not subside. The truth, that truth everyone sought and feared at the same time, seemed to slip through fingers like fine sand, impossible to catch with absolute certainty. Each new piece of information sowed more doubts and made every word spoken in that room carry an almost unbearable weight. The responsibility of deciding who was right, who deserved justice, felt in my chest like an inescapable burden. Sometimes I wondered how judges could be so cold, how anyone could be expected to choose a winner when all the pieces of the puzzle seemed forced to fit, always leaving gaps that could never be filled. That witness's confession made several lawyers rise from their seats, murmuring among themselves and occasionally casting inquisitive glances, seeking to find something more, some flaw that would give them an advantage. It was even more revealing to see how the families reacted to that moment. the mother barely holding back a tremor in her lips, and the other family with a mix of disbelief and relief that lasted only seconds before turning into anger. Deep down, both sides seemed about to explode, as if that partial truth, that unexpected stab, had torn through the fragile peace they had lived with during those weeks. The following hearings were an emotional minefield. The atmosphere in the room became dense, almost suffocating. In every look, I saw a universe of conflicting feelings: hatred, pain, nostalgia, frustration, and above all, a sense of abandonment. I tried to maintain balance, that apparent neutrality with which a judge must operate, but sometimes all of it seemed like a mere performance in the face of the palpable suffering filling the room. It was impossible to ignore that behind every legal argument were people with open wounds, broken families, and crushed dreams. One of the hardest moments came when the lawyer for the accused family presented evidence that had gone unnoticed until then. There were text messages, recordings, and photographs showing a completely different side of the deceased young man, not only as someone reckless, as the other family maintained, but also as someone struggling with deep personal problems that could have influenced that fatal night. It was then that the story stopped being just a legal conflict and became a raw and brutal human tale, full of contradictions that defied any easy resolution. I felt that revelation pushing me even further toward an abyss. How could any sentence balance those complexities? Could the law itself, with all its rigidity and rules, even contemplate the invisible cracks that cross human life? I increasingly understood that this case was not just about guilt or innocence, but about how we all bear our decisions and how those decisions sometimes imprison many people in a cycle of pain that seems endless. The sessions dragged on slowly, almost in slow motion, but the internal pressure did not ease. Usually, when the law is clear, the resolution is swift, but this case resisted any simplification, as if it hid layer upon layer of reality that not even the documents could capture. What I learned in those hours is that, in justice, waiting is also a silent punishment. None of those involved wanted this prolonged trial, but each knew it was also the last chance for their voices to be heard, for their pain to be acknowledged and perhaps even slightly eased. I remember one particular day when the room was especially tense. An angry argument between lawyers had to be called to order several times. At one point, the mother of the deceased young man stood up and, with a mixture of courage and desperation, shouted something that echoed beyond the courtroom walls. "This is not just about the law. This is for my son, for what they took from him. And you don't understand that no document will give me back what I lost." It was a breaking moment that left me frozen because those bare words showed what was truly at stake far beyond the files and evidence: the broken soul of a person, a mother who could never fully repair what was lost. That moment marked me deeply. It reminded me that, although my role was to administer justice based on the rules, I could not lose sight of the fact that behind every file was a human being looking with tired eyes, silently asking, pleading. The questions I had asked myself before the trial began were now much stronger and more personal. What does it really mean to deliver justice? Is it enough to simply uphold the law, or is something else needed? Is it possible that, at times, the clock of justice runs slower than the time of life and mourning? As the day to hear the final arguments approached, fatigue manifested in all of us, not just physical but emotional. The room seemed to age with every word spoken, with every pause heavy with meaning. The accused family was also divided. Some members couldn't hide their exhaustion and resignation, while others maintained a rigid stance, defending their version to the very last breath. It was hard to imagine that these same people, just a few months earlier, had shared happy moments, unaware of the suffering that tragedy would unleash. In my moments alone, I reviewed every detail, every statement, as if I could find within those fragments of information something to give me the strength to decide with less pain, to pronounce a sentence that would not hurt even more. But the more I studied, the clearer it became that justice is rarely clean or easy. It is often like a broken mirror where we try to reflect something whole, even though the pieces simply don't fit perfectly. Law is, in essence, an ideal, human reality, a constant challenge. When the day of the verdict finally arrived, I felt all my senses on the verge of bursting. The room was full but carried a strange, heavy silence, as if everyone knew what would be said was not a victory but a final point, an awkward closure that would bring no relief. I looked at both families and detected in their expressions a mix of desperate hope and tangible fear. At that moment, all the noise around me disappeared, and there was only me, bearing the responsibility of using the words that would close such a stormy chapter. As I began reading the ruling, my voice trembled slightly. I tried to maintain the calm my experience had taught me, but truthfully, I felt a lump in my throat. On the bench, my words were precise and clear, adhering to the legal framework, but I also left space for humanity, to acknowledge the pain no sentence could erase. I issued partial rulings that dismissed certain charges, but also recognized responsibilities that, together, left everyone with a bitter taste. I knew no one would leave there feeling victorious. The reaction was immediate. The mother cried silently, and some defendants wore stern expressions, almost challenging justice itself. I felt that, in that moment, I was delivering an uncomfortable truth for everyone. Justice does not always mean winning or losing. Sometimes it just means learning to live with wounds and consequences. When the hearing ended and I stepped down from the bench, no one congratulated or thanked me. Instead, there were looks full of reproach and also sadness that stabbed me like a knife. In the days that followed, I found that the courtroom where I decided that sentence had become a place I could barely bear to look at. The noise of the court seemed a distant echo, but the images of that trial, the voices and silences, gave me no respite. I reflected on what might have been if I could have done something different, if I could have tipped the scales a little more toward one side, even if that meant straying from the law. But I knew that was not my duty, that impartiality is the cornerstone of the system, even if sometimes it feels like a cage for everyone. Finally, I understood that that experience was more than a chapter in my career. It was a lesson that went beyond the legal code, a teaching about the limits of human justice and about the importance of empathy as an indispensable complement. That justice is not just about administering punishments or rewards, but also recognizing suffering and trying to alleviate it with humility, even though relief is never complete. That case, with all its pain and complexity, showed me that justice is a path full of shadows where often there is no clear or satisfactory ending, and that perhaps, by accepting that uncertainty, we can find a deeper meaning in our work. And so, when I remember that case today, I still feel the mixture of sadness and responsibility. Not because I failed to uphold the law, but because I learned to see that true justice is much more than laws and sentences. It is the constant search for balance between what is just and what is humane, a search that does not end with a verdict, but continues with every person who leaves the room, with every soul marked by the decisions we make. Perhaps that is the most uncertain sentence of all, understanding that sometimes, when no one wins, the real victory lies in continuing to try. After that verdict, what followed was not relief, but a kind of deep emptiness that gradually seeped into my days. The courtroom, that space which usually exuded a dry air of formality and order, now seemed impregnated with an invisible weight that made it hard to breathe. The faces of those present at the trial often came to mind, not their expressions from that exact moment, but those looks afterward, the ones that remained after the lights went out and the doors closed. I remembered how, for a moment, I noticed something in them that I had never seen so clearly before: silent defeat. That defeat which is not expressed with screams or confrontations, but with an intimate weariness, with the constant burden of knowing that the suffering would have no easy or just end. I couldn't shake the feeling that, despite the entire process and the hours spent analyzing every detail, justice had reached a dead end. No one was truly clean or free of guilt, and yet no one deserved to carry the full weight of that condemnation. The law, with all its normative strength, had proven insufficient to heal the wounds that, although invisible in a file, were deep in every heart. I thought of the mother crying at the stand, her heartbreaking words still echoing in my mind. How could I refer merely to articles and case law when she was screaming from her soul? That disconnection consumed me, because I knew it was part of my role to maintain that distance, but deep down, I wanted to offer something more, something not written in any code. Then came calls and messages I did not expect. They were neither congratulations nor thanks, but questions and, in some cases, direct reproaches. Some voices asked me for clarity, begged that I deliver true justice and not hide behind technical words. Others, in a colder and more calculating tone, accused me of being lenient, of not being strict enough with the accused family. It was a brutal reminder that in this role, it is impossible to please everyone. What is adequate justice for some is nothing more than a betrayal for others. This led me to a state of constant reflection. In my routine, every small moment became an opportunity to revisit the case, to try to understand what else I could have done differently. I walked the courthouse corridors with that almost physical burden, as if dragging a stone heavier than any file. I wondered if justice truly is a path or just a perpetual crossroads. Is it possible to administer it without breaking those involved? Or does justice, by definition, imply an irreparable sacrifice? Amid this emotional whirlwind, a new twist appeared after a few weeks. I received a confidential letter from an anonymous witness. I couldn't say how it reached my hands, perhaps through a court official or directly to my office. The content was disturbing. It claimed that there were details the trial had not gathered, that relevant facts had been omitted out of fear, self-interest, or ignorance. What the letter suggested was that the truth, or at least a crucial part of it, remained hidden. The idea that the case was not closed at all paralyzed me for a moment. I opened the letter over and over, trying to figure out whether it was a macabre invention or a sincere voice calling for real justice. I then decided, with extreme caution, to begin investigating. I could not proceed without the necessary legal guarantees, but neither could I ignore the impulse to keep digging into the story. I contacted some trusted colleagues, other judges and prosecutors I had known for years. Their reactions were varied: surprise, fear of reliving an exhausting process, but also understanding that sometimes justice must have the courage to look beyond cold files. These conversations led me to delicate terrain. I found people willing to speak behind closed doors, to share experiences and data that the official trial had not considered. Little by little, a new puzzle started to emerge, which, while not openly contradicting the verdict, nuanced and deepened it. During these weeks, the emotional toll I felt was immense, but I also began to experience something strange, a glimpse of hope. Not the naive hope that everything would be resolved, but the hope that leaving that door open was an act of respect for human complexity. In meetings and interviews, I realized that behind the tragedy were people willing to open up, not to seek scapegoats, but to understand. To understand what tends to be elusive for the judicial system, the context, the suffering that shaped every step, the silences heavier than words. As these revelations came to light, the community began to react. Not with a cry for immediate justice, but with slow and painful acknowledgement that wounds are not closed with a ruling. At these moments, I faced the reality that I could not return to the courtroom and change what had been decided, not even if I wanted to. The sovereignty of the verdict was inviolable, and learning to live with that limitation was another harsh lesson. However, what was in my hands was raising awareness. I was able to share these findings anonymously in legal and social forums, trying to ensure that the conversation about these difficult situations would not be buried under the weight of silence or indifference. Over time, I received messages from some people involved in the case, those who perhaps would never have spoken to me directly during the hearing. Some thanked the effort to not leave the story confined to paper, others expressed renewed pain, but above all, I felt an opportunity for reconciliation opening up, even if slow and distant. It was a process that, for me, emphasized that justice transcends the verdict and must engage the community. That understanding made me rethink even my role as a judge, as someone who not only rules but also listens and learns. But how do you bear that burden when no one emerges a true winner? How do you face the weight of knowing that the law alone cannot heal such deep fractures? Those questions accompany me every day, and although the answer is not simple, I have learned to accept that justice is imperfect. It is a human process full of flaws, but also sincere intentions. Impartiality can be a shield, but it must not hide the human face of the one who administers it. That, perhaps, is what that case left me with most, the urgent need to humanize what so often is reduced to codes and procedures. Returning to the present, Nowadays, that courtroom feels less intimidating and more a place for reflection. I do not forget, nor will I allow it to be forgotten, that behind legal formalism there is always someone suffering, someone trying to make sense of their loss. Justice, for me, is no longer a static goal or a definitive judgment, but a path under construction. A path that demands listening attentively, respecting the pain and complexity of every story, and having the courage to admit that no decision will be perfect, but that the effort to be just and humane deserves to continue. I think with some melancholy about that case, with all its nuances and the lesson it left, that justice is not a game of winners and losers, but rather a delicate dance where everyone ends up wounded, yet where wounds can have meaning if faced with honesty and empathy. Maybe the true victory lies in learning to live with those scars, in recognizing that the path of justice is, above all, a human path, full of uncertainties, shadows, and also, in its own way, hope. And although no one won in that trial, I still believe that in that constant effort, in that imperfect search, lies the true meaning of being a judge and, even more so, of being a person. The weeks that followed that first contact with the anonymous letter were a silent whirlwind that absorbed me completely. It wasn't just the implicit threat of a hidden truth, but the weight of the moral responsibility that began to slowly crush me. I had in my hands an enigma that I couldn't erase with official seals or the cold backing of a firm ruling. That brought me to a point where justice ceased to be an abstract concept and became a tangible entity that, curiously, felt both elusive and piercing to me, like a persistent echo reminding me that, despite everything, the story was not over. Every time I reviewed the original documents, the trial statements, and the notes I had taken, I found small details that now resonated with a different meaning. Like when, in a casual conversation with a longtime prosecutor, he mentioned in passing that certain political and media pressures had surrounded the case from the beginning. That was never recorded in the files, but it explained a lot. The pieces of the puzzle didn't quite fit, and that misalignment began to unsettle me more than the mere idea of having issued a ruling that was unsatisfactory. I then discovered that justice, as we understand it, is not always the sum of evidence and regulations. It's also a fragile fabric that envelopes human complexity, fears, secrets, betrayals, and, sometimes, tacit compromises that seem to protect some while hurting others. I struggled to accept that, beyond the trial, there were those parallel stories that were never verbalized, but that altered the course of events. One of those voices emerged through a discreet interview with a lawyer involved, who, with a certain contained fear, confessed to me that there had been veiled threats for crucial witnesses to change their testimony or disappear from the process altogether. That, in itself, was a crime that formal justice had failed to stop. That discovery opened a door I couldn't close. From that moment, many contacts began to arise. Judicial officials willing to speak under conditions of anonymity, a couple of journalists who had persistently followed the case and provided me with leads, and even family members of the parties involved, who after a while began to trust me and shared heartbreaking, complex, and contradictory accounts. Each new piece of information was another layer adding uncertainty. Not only about what had happened in the specific facts, but about how social pressure and hidden agendas can distort the perception of justice. Despite the discretion and secrecy with which I handled everything, the burden of what I was discovering began to take a toll on my personal life. At night, it was impossible for me to disconnect. The image of those people and their pain stuck to my skin. I needed to talk, but official channels prohibited me from sharing without solid proof. Frustration turned into anguish, and doubt into a constant shadow. How far should I push for the truth to emerge, and when did I risk unleashing irreparable chaos? These were decisions as heavy as the sentence I had issued. Then an unexpected twist occurred that upset the delicate balance I had managed to maintain, a clandestine meeting with someone who had essential information. The meeting was held in a dark cafe, away from public view, with the background noise hiding our voices. This person, a former employee of the criminal justice system who had decided to step away, shared details that changed my perspective. They spoke to me about the missing link, altered documents, manipulated testimonies to protect greater interests, and a network of silences involving figures I never imagined connected to the case. What struck me most was the certainty with which they spoke, a conviction that needed no proof but only their own integrity to sustain it. That conversation left me breathless. Not only because it challenged the legitimacy of the process, but because it confirmed something I already suspected: justice can be an illusion sustained by half-truths and invisible sacrifices. For a moment, my will to move forward faltered. Who was I to intervene in a system that, despite its flaws, was the pillar of our society? But at the same time, that very conversation sparked a new flame. If there was something I could do, it was to keep the conversation alive, to ensure these enigmas were not buried under the silence of indifference or convenience. I returned to my office with a mix of anxiety and determination. I knew I couldn't change the verdict or remedy the past suffering, but I could try to bring that half-hidden truth to light, to have it discussed, evaluated, and above all, understood. I began to gather testimonies, analyses, documents, and accounts that until then seemed like scattered fragments without connection. Little by little, the unofficial story came to life, with its imperfections, gaps, but also with brutal honesty. The legal community, although divided, began to pay attention to those anonymous voices demanding a different recognition of justice. Curiously, that process neither eased the pain nor brought easy answers. It expanded the view of what justice implies. I learned that sometimes justice must not only be a punishment or formal compensation, sometimes it must be a space for bare truth, for imperfect reconciliation, for the recognition of invisible wounds. During those weeks, I saw myself not only as a judge, but as a kind of guardian of collective memory, of those stories that don't fit into a file. One of the most difficult revelations came when members of the affected family approached me with a gesture of openness I never imagined. They had carried deep resentment toward the judicial system and me, but slowly, some of their words showed a different search: the need to find meaning, not in the ruling, but in the recognition of their experiences. In those conversations, I felt justice began to change shape, setting aside its rigidity to become more human. It was not a triumph, not a total relief, but a step toward the collective understanding that the wound was not only individual, but shared. Meanwhile, reactions in the city were mixed. Some sectors rejected any questioning of the sentence, citing respect for authority and legal certainty. Others, however, began to raise public debates about the need to review how social and emotional justice are integrated into legal processes. Meetings in forums and academic circles, many organized in secret or under confidentiality, became vital spaces to open wounds and seek new answers. In those discussions, even those with opposing views agreed on something fundamental: justice cannot be only cold and technical when palpable suffering pulses around it. Amid all this, I understood that the real challenge was not only unraveling the hidden truth behind that case, but facing the inherent paradox of our work, being carriers of the law that must be objective, but also humans who empathize with real pain. This constant tension is what defines and at the same time limits justice. I realized that no matter how much we wish, there will never be a sentence that leaves everyone satisfied or erases the scars, because those scars are part of the story itself. Despite the emotional and professional burden, I took that lesson as a beacon in the dark. Justice must advance not only with the rigor of the court, but also with the humility to recognize its limits and the sensitivity to accompany those who suffer. This case pushed me to be not just a judge issuing rulings, but a person more aware of the impact those words have on real life. And although that sentence was my most uncertain verdict, it was also the one that taught me the most about the need to listen without prejudice, to look beyond the obvious, and to understand that, often, justice is a path traveled halfway, with uncertain steps and open wounds. At the end of that cycle, I found no absolute answers or firm certainties, but a new way of seeing my role and the system. Every day since then, I question whether the decisions made in the courtroom truly reflect the lives of people, and how much remains to be done to humanize a process that by its essence should care for and protect. This story, without clear winners, with its shadows and lights, left me something invaluable, The conviction that justice is a constant, imperfect, and necessary effort, because without that effort, wounds would only multiply in silence. And so, with that mix of resignation and commitment, I move forward. Knowing that true justice cannot be frozen in a final act, but must be woven day by day, with the courage to acknowledge that no one is exempt from doubt or pain. Because in that acknowledgement, perhaps lies the seed to prevent cases like that from repeating, and so that in the future, law and humanity can intertwine in a more just and authentic way. Although no one won that trial, I continue to believe that the greatest victory lies in never ceasing to seek, to question, and to humanize what legally seems impossible. The nights that followed that clandestine meeting became a space of insomnia and deep reflection. Every detail revealed by that former official seemed to weigh more than anyone could have anticipated. The idea of altered documents, manipulated testimonies, and agreed silences pointed to a much more complex and darker web than the mere legal dispute I had judged. I felt I was facing a network that went beyond a single case, extending to the very foundations of the judicial system, and who knows if even further. Touching interests that rarely came to light but strongly influenced decisions and public perception of justice. I then realized that my steps could no longer be clumsy or impulsive. Every move had to be calculated with the precision of someone handling a candle blindly in the middle of a cave. The weight of implicating powerful actors and the genuine fear of reprisals forced me to adopt a caution that sometimes made progress slow and frustrating. However, the certainty that I could not turn my back on that latent truth kept me firm. The feeling of responsibility not only as a judge but as a guardian of something much greater than a sentence became my driving force. Little by little, I began to weave a network of confidences and information, always in secret, using discreet channels to avoid arousing suspicion. Retired lawyers, brave journalists unafraid of scandal, even some police officers who had worked on the original investigation contributed pieces of a puzzle that until then had gone unnoticed by most. That's when the first major twist emerged, an anonymous testimony, delivered urgently, directly pointing to a high-ranking judicial official as part of the manipulation machinery. It was not just a name or an accusation. It came loaded with details about secret meetings and agreements to suppress certain uncomfortable statements. That revelation was an earthquake that shook my convictions. I faced an ethical and professional dilemma that seemed to have no easy solution. Should I denounce corruption that could sink the already fragile trust of society in justice, or continue to safeguard the stability of the system despite its shadows? In the end, I remembered why I had chosen this path, because integrity and the pursuit of truth, though painful, are essential not to lose the compass. That very moment marked a before and after. I decided that, no matter what, I would do everything possible to make those invisible voices heard, even if it meant risking my career and personal peace. From that moment on, the pressure manifested in different forms. I received anonymous messages, both warnings and support, making me aware that I was crossing dangerous territory. At first, I tried to isolate myself. I did not want to burden those around me with that weight, but loneliness was a cold and exhausting companion. Sharing my anguish with a few close friends helped me maintain sanity, although we all knew that speaking was a risk in itself. The paradox was clear. The closer I got to a truer version of the facts, the more I felt I was moving away from the comfort and certainty any judge desires in their work. It was precisely in the midst of that personal storm that I received another unexpected blow, a call I did not expect. The family of one of the victims, after months of reservation and distrust, decided to seek a meeting with me. They had questions, yes, but also a sincere need to understand what more could be done. In that meeting, in a small room of a public library, barriers began to fall. Their words mixed pain, anger, and a genuine desire for reparation that went far beyond any sentence or compensation. They told me stories that never came out in court, details of how everyone's life had been fractured and changed forever, not only because of the events themselves, but because of the way justice, formally applied, had left open spaces of resentment and emptiness. What they really needed, and they told me with tears and firm voice, was recognition that validated their suffering, a dialogue that would allow healing to begin, even if only partially. At that moment, I understood something I had been sensing. The justice dictated by courts is often only a part, an insufficient one, of a much more human and painful process. This conversation pushed me to explore paths I had not considered before. It was not enough to expose shortcomings or prove corruption. It was necessary to think about mechanisms that built bridges between parties, incorporating emotional and social dimensions, even if that meant challenging established legal structures and breaking usual molds. I thought about initiatives like restorative justice, spaces where victims could express themselves freely and where those responsible, to the extent possible, face the real impact of their actions beyond mere sanctions. It was an almost unexplored field in the judicial sphere where I moved, but I felt I had to promote it, even if only from my discreet position and with small actions. Meanwhile, the city continued to vibrate with different echoes of that case. I noticed how the media, even after a period of silence, resumed the story with new interviews and investigative reports that questioned the rigor of the judicial process. Social networks burned with debates, with opposing positions ranging from staunch defense of the system to outrage over the apparent impunity hidden beneath institutional layers. Amid all that noise, what surprised me most was the emergence of a citizen movement that did not simply demand a change in a sentence or economic reparation, but a profound transformation in how our society conceived and practiced justice. In one of those informal meetings with activists and experts, I was invited to participate in a forum where, among more than 100 people, I shared my experience with the sentence I had issued and the months of investigation and reflection afterward. It was a revealing moment. For the first time, I felt the story that should have been just another case in my career took on a life of its own, that the words and feelings I had kept for so long resonated with others. The conversation revolved around concepts never deeply discussed in courts: justice as a continuous process, empathy as a driving force for more humane decisions, and the need to listen without judgment to all voices, including the most uncomfortable. The debate was intense, full of emotions and questions that at first even made me doubt my own conviction. But that doubt was also necessary because it allowed for an authentic and open dialogue. I learned that justice cannot be an immovable dogma, but a proposal that must constantly review its own principles and methods. The initial heaviness I felt after that sentence gradually transformed into a motivating force that pushed me to be an active part of that change. But it was not all a smooth path. As I progressed in gathering more testimonies and began outlining ideas to reform judicial practices, I received clear signs of resistance. Some colleagues distrusted my intentions and saw danger in opening debates that could destabilize the system. There were those who warned me that I risked my reputation and even future jobs, and at times I felt the coldness of those discourses as a wall that seemed unbreakable. However, I understood that this was precisely one of the greatest obstacles: the inertia of a system that resists change to protect its stability at the cost of hiding uncomfortable truths. Faced with that resistance, I chose a stance of active patience. I began writing articles, supporting groups seeking reforms, and working discreetly within the system to promote small but significant changes. I started promoting training for judges and officials on the emotional and social aspects of justice, aiming to humanize a process often reduced to coldness and technicalities. In those minimal actions, I saw sparks of hope, people who, though exhausted by routine, were willing to question and transform. A significant event was a roundtable at a local university, where young law students, activists, and professionals shared opinions about the case that had marked me so deeply. The youth, with their energy and fresh perspectives, showed me that the future was not lost, that there was a desire to rethink justice from its foundations so that it would not be just a bureaucratic shield, but a true instrument of dignity and reparation. Their enthusiasm contrasted with my weariness, but also infected me with a renewed sense of purpose. That constant process of searching, listening, and learning left me with an intense certainty: justice is not a final destination, but a path without a defined map. A place where invisible pacts, hidden wills, fears, and hopes intersect, overflowing and sometimes frustrating the letter of the law. My most uncertain sentence was no longer just an unbalanced scale between guilty and victims, but a compass guiding me through a territory that requires courage to face the truth however uncomfortable it may be. Throughout that last chapter, I understood that nobody wins when justice closes in on itself, nor when shortcomings are allowed to be covered behind untouched procedures. But I also knew it was not about seeking absolute winners or magical solutions. The true victory lies in keeping the conversation alive, in opening spaces so justice can also be an act of attentive listening, deep understanding, and sincere repair, even if imperfect. And while the echo of those days continues resonating within me, I know my task did not end with that ruling or the revelations that followed. Every day, in the courtroom or in everyday life, justice demands that delicate balance between law and humanity. And although no one came out winning in that sentence, it taught me that the greatest triumph is to never stop seeking the truth, to fearlessly confront the conflict it generates, and to push for the transformation of a system that, though imperfect, can become increasingly just if we learn to listen without fear and act with respect toward the pain behind every file. That is why I am still here, walking that uncertain path, with the conviction that justice is above all an act of humanity, a principle that reinvents itself in every story and only reaches its full meaning when it recognizes that behind the laws lives beat with open wounds and hopes to heal. In that intertwining beats my commitment, and I know there is still much to discover, much to change, and that this process, though slow and full of shadows, is the only one worth pursuing. Days turned into weeks, and the burden I carried on my shoulders seemed to grow with every conversation, every secret revealed with fear and hope. There were nights when I would mentally review everything I knew, searching for patterns, connections, something that would make sense of that seemingly endless web of lies and half-truths. It wasn't just isolated corruption that could point to a culprit. It was a system that, at many moments, appeared impermeable, with layers upon layers of invisible complicities that trampled justice in its purest form. I increasingly felt like I was walking on minefield ground, where one wrong step could destroy not only my career, but also the integrity of the system I had served for so long. But at the same time, I also began to see a faint light, a kind of crack through which truth could sneak without the whole structure collapsing. That crack was the silent will of many, sometimes barely a whisper, who wanted to change things, who no longer wanted to be accomplices or passive spectators. The testimonies I gathered in secret, the stories I heard in confidence, all had one common denominator: the fatigue of a justice system that forgets the people. That was the key that led me to believe that change didn't come from outside, but from within, from those who, although trapped in rigid structures, still had the capacity to open doors and windows to let fresh air in. Suddenly, the case ceased to be just a personal matter and became a small movement growing in secret but with strength. I couldn't organize it publicly. I knew that would be professional suicide for me, but I could sow ideas, generate dialogues in small spaces, plant inquietudes that could grow in others. I began to invite colleagues willing to listen to discreet meetings, conversations that sometimes lasted until dawn, where we mixed frustration with hope, exhaustion with new ideas. In those nameless, placeless meetings, we began to imagine a different judicial system, one that recognized and legitimized the human complexity behind each case. However, the tension also grew outside those invisible four walls. One day I received an anonymous letter with words that left no room for doubt. They were watching my every move. The threat was subtle, not explicit, but enough to remind me I was not alone, that the machine against truth could become relentless. That letter made me reflect on the price I was willing to pay, on the fragility of the position I was in. I could walk away from it all, give up the burden and the strain, but what would happen to those who, despite everything, still believed that change was possible? It was at that moment, when fear began whispering for me to stop, that an unexpected call arrived. It was a man, voice trembling, who said he had crucial information to understand what was happening. We agreed to meet at a cafe far from the city center, such a common place that no one would imagine that secrets capable of changing the fate of many were being brewed there. When I finally arrived, he was already waiting for me, with a discreet leather briefcase and an expression that reflected years of silence. He opened the briefcase and took out a folder with documents, photographs, and recordings that proved not only the manipulation of the case, but also the modus operandi of that network of corruption involving officials, politicians, and businessmen. My heart was pounding as I looked at each page, each accumulated piece of evidence. This was much bigger than I had imagined. It was not just a poorly resolved judicial case, it was the tip of the iceberg of a rotten system that had turned its back on fairness and truth. At that moment, I understood that I could no longer turn back. Prudence would give way to action, but a calculated action, because this time I was not alone. I carried with me the voice of the people, the hope of the victims, and the firm conviction that this had to change. I returned home with the folder hidden under my coat, aware that every move had to be measured, also aware of the danger. The next morning, I began drafting a detailed report, not for a court, but to hand over to a select group of journalists and activists who, I knew, could use that information to take over. The idea was not just to denounce, but to provoke a domino effect, to sow questions in public opinion and force institutions to respond. All of this with the risk involved, knowing it could affect lives, including mine. But I couldn't remain silent any longer. Days passed and the news began to leak. At first, timid rumors, until a major news outlet published an investigation largely based on my documents. The whole city was stirred. The judicial system, instead of ignoring the evidence, reacted with hostility, labeling the information as unfounded and attacking those who carried it. I received harsh criticisms through letters, calls, and anonymous comments that questioned my professional ethics. But I also received messages of support from people who felt that finally the silence was broken, that there was hope to change something that seemed irreparable. The most striking moment, however, was a meeting arranged by phone at my office with an unexpected group, high-ranking judicial officials, some of the same who could be affected by the revelations, but willing to listen. There I understood that it was not only a frontal clash against the system, but an opportunity to start a complex, uncomfortable but necessary dialogue. If I really wanted something to change, it was not enough to denounce and point fingers. I had to build bridges and be part of that transformation, even if that meant negotiating with human imperfections and contradictions. From that meeting, internal commissions, reflection workshops, and pilot programs began to emerge aimed at incorporating elements of restorative justice and deepening the emotional training of judges and lawyers. It was not enough, far from it, but it was a start. And that small victory made me regain faith in the possibility of gradual change, in the patient construction of a future where justice does not crush, but listens, understands, and heals. Today I know that the sentence I handed down that day, which left everyone dissatisfied, was just one page in a much bigger story. A story of pain, of mistakes, but also of tireless pursuit of truth and reparation. The process is not over, nor will it be soon, but I am convinced that justice must be a seed that grows with the strength of human voices, not a wall that separates and condemns. Truth has transformative power, even when it hurts, and only those who dare to face it can open the way to a better future. And as I close this chapter, one thing remains clear in my mind: justice is not a final point, it is a constant and fragile construction. The most uncertain of all sentences was, in reality, the beginning of a path that raises deeper questions than any ruling can solve. Because in the end, no one won that battle, but perhaps, with courage and commitment, we can lose so that others can truly win. This is not just my story, it is a call to all who believe in justice to join this endless pursuit without fear, knowing that true transformation begins when we accept that justice is not only applied but lived, felt, and renewed with every life it touches.